This one was one that I picked because this may be my favorite. So I'm going to start. It is a story where Sisko is injured or has some sort of medical issue and passes out. And we awaken in the 1950s New York City, probably Harlem. And it is the story of Benjamin Sisko as a science fiction writer who creates an entire universe around a space station deep in space on the frontier, captained by what was called a Negro captain. And what he went through to create this captain and what happened to him as a science fiction writer. It basically was Deep Space Nine in the head of someone else. And I absolutely loved those types of stories. They were
Yeah.
in the original series, they were in TNG, and God bless them, they're here in Deep Space Nine. And the story was about, I thought it was about racism. But the director of the show, one Avery Brooks, said maybe not. So maybe not about racism. But I grew up in a segregated South. I went to segregated schools. I saw that firsthand. I know what that's like. I saw that in the show. It was sort of all the tropes that we think of racism in the United States, the corrupt cops, the slick juvenile delinquent black man who gets his due by being shot by the police at the end. We have the black athlete and who gets all the black girls. We have the woman running the diner who is the sort of community hub. And we have this black science fiction writer in a wonderful science fiction writing magazine with the tropes of science fiction writing at its finest for a science fiction magazine. And all of that came together in a way that talked about racism, that talked about family, that talked about should you follow your dream or should you follow your pocketbook? Should you do what you want or should you do the practical? Um, should you live on the margins of society and what does that mean? And we had a preacher, of course, because it's about the Black experience. So we get to have a preacher as well. And every one of those characters was a Deep Space Nine character. And this all plays out in Cisco's head, or did it? We don't know the answer to that. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed this episode. I think my introduction has done little to no justice to the entire episode. But Megan, what were your sort of opening thoughts on Far Beyond the Stars?
Love this one too. And I guess I thought, uh, first, I guess just seeing the characters that we love so much in this completely new setting with different personas, but a lot of essential similarities. I thought was just what a treat. What an absolute treat to see. You get to see like in the 50s outfits with the 50s verbiage and the interrelationships that are not entirely dissimilar to react to the reality of life on DS9. And I love the questions that the show brings up about, is this the reality? Is this all the dream? It really made me think of, I don't know if I'm the only one who sees the Buffy episode Normal again, where Buffy the Vampire Slayer is revealed to actually be, a troubled young woman in a mental institution, and all of the
Mm.
vampires and all the friends and all the family were a figment of her imagination. It is completely unclear as to whether or not that is canonically true or not. I like being made to question that. I don't
Yeah.
question it as deeply in DS9, I think, because there are so many other canon Star Trek franchises. But I love that they went there, and I love the way they explored the inter-character relationships by putting them in different personas, but having these echoes of relationships, one trait borrowed from one and used by another, the relationships slightly changing, but always almost always having this kind of inherent similarity or direct contrast, one or the other, between who they really are. So I loved it. And of course, watching especially these characters in a time and place when racism was so much, not that it isn't still happening, but so much more open and overt. And there's such a mirror to, which Murphy, I know you're going to jump into a little bit, but between how Ducat considers the Bajorans, how white systems of power consider non-white participants,
You know,
Yeah, I thought really interesting, and it all blends together really well into some very interesting commentary.
Murphy?
yeah, you raised a really good point about alternate personas for the characters. I watched this again last night and I started thinking about that and realizing that Armin Sherman's character is very left leaning and anti capitalist as a diametrically opposed Quark. Rene Auberjonois' character is concerned with the status quo and not about achieving justice. Chief O'Brien's character writes stories about robots, but he's kind of hapless and bumbling and he's not a mechanic. It really is a very interesting episode. And I love that they included Brock Peters as the preacher, like Sisko's dad showing up as the preacher. I love his sort of vibe that he's just kind of working around on the corners. There are so many things in this episode. I'm glad I must confess, I like this episode a lot. It's never been one of my favorites, but I do really like it a lot. But it was so interesting watching it last night. I felt like I was watching it anew. I don't think I've seen it in a long time, but yeah, just very interesting. And the real idea of whether Benny Russell is in Sisko's head or if Sisko is in Benny Russell's head. I think it's both. I think it's both, and I think it's neither. There's one possibility that Benny Russell was a real person and that Sisko is inhabiting him via the prophets to sort of see everything, which would explain why everyone in there looks like people he knows. But then it's possible that the prophets went back in time and set up Benny Russell's life in order to have someone for Sisko to go back to. And you'll see this later too, because Benny Russell comes back. We find out what happens to him. He goes nuts, and it's all sort of part of this test that the prophets are putting him through. Benny Russell, for lack of a better word, Benny Russell is the penance that they talk about. When Sisko goes into the wormhole and he has the prophets send the fleet of Dominion ships away, they say a penance must be exacted. This is it. This is where it starts. This is part of his to sort of, I guess, fight the paw raids. And it calls back the last episode, and Walt, Ducat's madness sends him down a rabbit hole where he becomes the emissary for the paw wraiths. And this one, the madness he experiences as Benny Russell sort of helps him shore up his strength as a kind of test. You'll see this later when the reckoning happens, and then later on, this is testing him to see his virtue to work with the prophets. It's really interesting, and I like that they did it entirely in a new setting, like you said, with just completely different to how we would normally approach a DS9 episode. It's absolutely brilliant because it leaves you constantly wondering through the whole thing. Just so good.
Tom, you're muted.
Usually I say something along the lines of I had forgot something about an episode. On this one, I remembered something that didn't happen in the episode.
Mm.
And I remembered the episode ended with Benny Russell in a padded room with a blue piece of chalk having detailed the entire timeline of DS9 over 4 different walls.
You're not
I
wrong.
remembered that too.
You're not wrong. That is because he goes and looks for the orb of the emissary and he has a vision of Benny Russell. And he's in a padded room and he's writing all of DS9 on the wall. And then Casey Bakes, who plays Dumar, comes in as the asylum doctor and hands him a roller of paint and says, erase everything. People who are sane don't write on walls. And that's one of the choices. But yeah, you're not wrong. You did remember it. It's just the continuation of the episode going on next season.
But just to
The
clarify
other
really quickly
thing
to make
that
sure
was
I
going
understand.
on in this episode was a study of religious, racial, and political prejudices in the 50s.
Yeah.
Because we had one character, of course, a Jew, who was the communist. We had one character who, Rene Ebersol, was the manager or the head of the office, and he reported to an owner, not a corporate owner, but a single person capitalist owner. So we had that. I love your description of Chief O'Brien, Cassidy Yates as the owner of the diner And I was even intrigued with the baseball player who I assumed to have been Willie Mays because he played in New York in the 50s. And even he said, we can't live anywhere else.
Yeah.
Um, there was a lot going on in the background as well. And then and I guess it was Kira who was KC something was her
Yeah.
name. And that was a direct honorarium to DC Fontana
Yeah.
from Star Trek, the original series. And even in the 60s, she didn't feel like she could use her Christian name. I think it
Yeah.
was Doris. She had to use her initials, so she'd be taken seriously as a science fiction writer. So they weren't off by far on that. So that whole part of it fascinated me as well. And it was just an Easter egg hunt
Of
of
stuff.
deliciousness on the desk. The artwork. I remember when they passed out the artwork at the very start of the episode, and it was very interesting. And I just can't get over, like I said, I love stories that make you wonder, is this inside someone's head? What's the epitaph of Benny Russell? What's the epitaph of Sisko? What's the epitaph of D Space Nine? And the creativity that I saw in this episode as well.
Mhm. Yeah, I always thought it was takes place in San Francisco because you see what's his name in a Giants uniform, but I guess it's the New York Giants because it's 53, so they haven't moved yet.
Right.
Yeah,
They don't move till 56.
56. Yeah.
So, Megan, anything
Yeah.
else?
I wanted to call it something that Murphy, you brushed on just a little, but I wanted to, I think, maybe explore it just a little bit more about
Mhm.
the existence of Benny Russell being the penance the prophets give to Cisco. And so,
Yeah.
if I'm understanding correctly, are you positing that Cisco's penance, like the payment he must make for having the Dominion ships leave, is a forever and constant questioning of the nature of his own reality? Because
I
it's
think that's
twisted
part of
and
it.
amazing.
Yeah,
That's incredible.
I think that's part of it. It starts a little earlier when he goes to Bahala and he finds the city. When that sort of proves that he's the emissary. Um, it happens when he takes the weird Jajara emissary into the wormhole and they're like, yeah, we don't know who you are. And the prophets are like, this is the Cisco. He's the dude. But yes, I think that's part of it. The prophets are setting him up on an eternal test of loyalty. And the ultimate act of that is his own, his willingness to sacrifice his own life. They also do this during the reckoning towards the end of the series. Apare inhabits Jake and Kira is inhabited by a prophet and they have the reckoning on the promenade. Kira says to Win, I think, the emissary is willing to sacrifice his own son to save Bajor and save the prophets. They are going to be constantly having him question his own reality. They do this later with his mother. The whole setup revealed with Cisco and sending out a new orb, the orb of the emissary. Like I said in past ones, Cisco sets up his own timeline from meeting the prophets, and they will constantly be tweaking that timeline and making him sort of question himself. And you see it we saw it in the last one. He's unraveling. He's seriously starting to question himself. And as a result, one of the neat little tidbits in this episode, when his father walks into his office in the beginning of the episode, there's a look on Cisco's face that is just sour. He's just joyless. He's completely burnt out. And at the end of the episode, he has this renewal. It's like in Waltz, he says, I'm not going to let anything happen to Bajor. But in this one, he's gone through something, he's been renewed. And the prophets say this too. One of my notes, it says, the path of prophets leads into darkness and pain. That sets up the conflict really well. But then, and I love this, that shot of him in the ambulance flying through space has got to be one of the most beautiful shots in the series. It's so perfect. And then Brad Peters turns to him and says, you are the dreamer and the dream. Benny Russell and Cisco exist in tandem, but you never really know where or one bleeds into the other. But yeah, it's totally for Cisco to sort of start and achieve something. He is ultimately being tested constantly.
Let me pick up on that and maybe explore the theme you've used in this episode and our prior episode, Murphy, of madness. And we went into Ducat and his madness extensively in Waltz, and now we're seeing Sisko in his madness. Could we even talk about how both men, literally over 6 years, have been driven to these points because of the pressure they've respectively been under? Is this a story arc that's plausible? And could their bodies just be saying, "Hey, both of you guys have had enough.
You know,
You're gonna break down," because the madness of Cisco in this obviously goes a very different way than Ducat, but it's still madness.
yeah,
And it's still his mind is trying to shield him or hide him from some greater horror that he's gonna have to face.
yeah,
I think that's a really interesting idea. Kind of comparing like they say the sentient mind needs to protect itself in some way. And I think it's interesting that Ducat, the stress he was under was largely self-imposed by his own beliefs about how the world should be. And Cisco's tension seems to largely come from things that are imposed upon him or situations that he finds himself in.
yeah.
And I don't have a conclusion really to this statement, but I think it's very interesting
No, you're
that
exactly right. It's like I said in the last one, it's Cisco yelling, "What the hell do you want from me?" constantly. What does Starfleet want from him? What does his father want from him? What does, to a lesser extent, Jake? What is his widow? What do the prophets want? What does Bajor want? He is a man of constant demands, but he rises to challenges really well. See, nobody wants Ducat to do anything because Ducat doesn't care about anybody ultimately but Ducat. He doesn't put any effort into anything. And he resents the hell out of Cisco. And Cisco came to Bajor and immediately became a religious icon and beloved. Ducat can't get past that. We've talked about that before. He's just incapable of getting past this own thing with himself. But I think, yeah, ultimately, Ducat's stresses are that his calamitous disasters, his screw ups are just never ending. I mean, he brings Cardassia into the Dominion and he's just a fapless idiot the whole time. He gets no respect from anybody. And I think it just breaks it. It just breaks him and finally shatters that stuff. But yes, Cisco's madness is just, again, it's imposed by others. Whereas I think Ducat's is a longing for something that he can never achieve, if that makes any sense.
That's very interesting because I would have almost said the opposite, that Cisco's madness was based upon choices Cisco made.
Yeah.
And the entire series, other than the death of his wife at Wolf 354 or 359, were all decisions he's made. And he's made the decision to go to Deep Space Nine. He's made the decision to stay. He's made the decision to be the emissary to the prophets. They may have picked him, but he made the decision himself and literally every other decision. So
Yeah.
I found that really interesting.
You raise an interesting point because what is the nature of Cisco's free will? How has he been set up in the past? And we find that later too. How has he been set up in the past to follow a path that the prophets wanted him to follow? He finds the prophets and becomes their emissary because they send Sarah back into the past to make sure that he exists. I think there's a conscious awareness of this. I think, yeah, he makes a lot of his own decisions, but I think he's definitely being pulled through time towards something. That's again, he is the dreamer and the dream. And you never are supposed to know which one comes first, if that makes any
it's
sense.
it's really interesting that the prophets and those oppressive police officers in both timelines are equally implacable. He
Mhm.
has the character of Benny Russell, and then the person of Cisco. They don't really can only make choices within the range it seems that they're being allowed.
Hey,
Yeah, really fascinating mirror.
it's a really interesting one. I mean, it raises a lot of questions, and I just thought it was it's such a good parallel to the last one. Just to see how both characters approach this sort of mental breakdowns or at the hands of forces outside of their control. It's really interesting. I think it's a fantastic pick. It's one of the things I don't think you can cover if you're doing a cover of DS9 and you don't want to view this episode. I mean, it's crazy.
Did you have any
I
other
don't
kind
think
of points or ideas, Tom?
actually, I don't think I can do better than that. Guys, this has been great. Thank you for indulging me on this episode.
Oh,
Can't
no.
wait to see what we come up with next time.
Thank you for choosing it. It's a great one.